Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Confederate battle flag that's flown on the South Carolina State House grounds for more than 50 years comes down today. Governor Nikki Haley signed a bill Thursday to permanently remove the flag after the House and Senate overwhelmingly approved it earlier this week. The flag is scheduled to come down at 10 a.m. Eastern Time today, just over 3 weeks after the massacre of 9 African-American churchgoers by suspect Dylann Roof, who embraced the Confederate flag. We'll have more on South Carolina with the granddaughter of the late South Carolina Senator and segregationist Strom Thurmond after headlines. As South Carolina lawmakers vote to take down the Confederate battle flag, Republicans in the U.S. Congress blocked a measure to remove it from the U.S. Capitol. Republicans also introduced a measure to allow Confederate flags in national cemeteries. Republicans eventually withdrew the bid following protests by Democrats, including New York Congressmember Hakeem Jeffries.
The members of the Republican conference who support the Confederate battle flag apparently argue that this is about heritage and tradition. What exactly is the tradition the Confederate battle flag is meant to represent? Is it slavery, rape, kidnap, genocide, treason, or all of the above?
In North Charleston, South Carolina, about 2 hours from the state capitol and the debate over the Confederate flag, the mother of Walter Scott visited the site of her son's death for the first time. Walter Scott was an unarmed African-American man shot dead in April by white police officer Michael Slager, who was charged with murder after video showed he shot Scott in the back as he ran away. Walter Scott's brother, Anthony, spoke during the family's visit to the fenced-in field where his brother died.
It's hard trying to face it with my mom and my dad because I, for the longest, have tried to keep them away from the site. But I know there has to bring some closure has to come. And when we're getting closer to that time, we have to come and face it and look it head on.
The officer accused of killing Walter Scott, Michael Slager, is in the same Charleston jail where Dylann Roof is being held. Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras has submitted a bailout proposal which includes harsh austerity measures just days after the Greek people overwhelmingly rejected such measures in an historic referendum. The proposal submitted to Greece's creditors reportedly includes tax increases, pension cuts, a reduction in military spending, and the privatization of public assets. It comes after Tsipras himself had urged the Greek people to reject creditors' demands for further austerity. In exchange for the reforms, Greece would receive a 3-year, $59 billion bailout package. Germany, meanwhile, appears to be yielding to demands to provide at least some measure of debt relief to Greece. European officials have expressed approval for the Greek offer ahead of a key meeting on Saturday. The Greek parliament's expected to vote on the bailout proposal today, just 5 days after an overwhelmingly 61% of Greek voters rejected similar terms. We'll have more on Greece later in the broadcast with Mark Weisbrot. The United Nations has announced a humanitarian truce in Yemen to allow aid to reach civilians facing a possible famine. The truce calls for a pause in Saudi-led airstrikes and clashes with Shiite Houthi rebels beginning today and lasting until the end of Ramadan on July 17th. Iran and world powers are continuing talks to reach a nuclear deal in Vienna. The failure to reach an agreement before today means the U.S. Congress will now take 60 rather than 30 days to approve any deal, keeping U.S. sanctions in place in the meantime. Secretary of State John Kerry said he would not continue to negotiate indefinitely.
We also recognize that we shouldn't get up and leave simply because the clock strikes midnight. And I emphasize, given that the work here is incredibly technical and that the stakes are very, very high, we will not rush and we will not be rushed. And we won't let ourselves be rushed through any aspect of this.
The Obama administration's acknowledged a breach of government computer systems was far worse than they initially disclosed. Hackers stole information, including fingerprints and Social Security numbers, from 21.5 million people. The Office of Personnel Management said everyone who received a government background check over the last 15 years was likely impacted. The U.S. Army has announced plans to eliminate 40,000 soldiers from its ranks. Army Force Management Director Randy George announced the cuts.
This October, we'll start reducing the active component by another 40,000 soldiers. Driven by fiscal constraints resulting from the Budget Control Act of 2011 and Defense Strategic and Budgetary Guidance, this reduction amounts to a cumulative cut of 120,000 soldiers from the regular Army, or 21% since 2012. This will also be accompanied by the reduction of approximately 17,000 Department of the Army civilian employees. These cuts will impact nearly every Army installation, both in the continental United States and overseas.
The reduction in U.S. troops has drawn criticism from Republican lawmakers who voted in favor of budget cuts the Pentagon warned would reduce its ranks. The Obama administration is reportedly poised to remove Malaysia from its list of the worst human trafficking hubs in a move that will ease negotiations over the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. Last year, the United States downgraded Malaysia to a Tier 3 rating, but a measure by New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez bars the United States from enacting trade deals with Tier 3 countries. Despite protests from human rights groups, Reuters reports the State Department will upgrade Malaysia's status, allowing it to remain part of the TPP. Wisconsin Republican Governor Scott Walker is poised to sign a bill banning non-emergency abortions after 20 weeks of pregnancy with no exception for rape or incest. As Walker prepares to launch his presidential campaign Monday, he's also expected to sign a state budget which slashes funding for the University of Wisconsin, expands the voucher program for private schools, requires drug testing for welfare recipients, and eliminates the state's living wage law. A super PAC backing Republican presidential contender Jeb Bush says it's raised a record $103 million in the first half of this year. In total, the super PAC had Bush's campaign have raised more than $114 million, far outstripping Democratic and Republican rivals. The news comes as Bush is facing criticism for telling the New Hampshire Union Leader newspaper Americans need to work longer hours.
Which means we have to be a lot more productive. Workforce participation has to rise from its all-time modern lows. Means that people need to work longer hours and through their productivity gain more income for their families.
Americans already work more hours than people in any other industrialized country, and despite a 25% rise in worker productivity over recent years, wages have flatlined. Immigrants who were held at a private prison run by the GEO Group in Aurora, Colorado, have filed a landmark federal lawsuit saying the company violated anti-trafficking law by forcing them to work for $1 a day under the threat of solitary confinement. This week, U.S. District Judge John Kane allowed the lawsuit to move forward. The immigrants say they spent hours cleaning toilets, mopping, and preparing meals. Attorneys say the lawsuit is the first of its kind. A federal judge has scolded the Obama administration for stalling its release of footage showing forced feedings of Guantanamo prisoners. Attorneys for former prisoner Abu al-Dayyab have fought for the tapes to be made public, saying he was force-fed over 1,000 times in retaliation for going on hunger strike. District Judge Gladys Kessler ordered the video's release back in October, but the government has said it needs months to redact faces and names of U.S. personnel. On Thursday, Judge Kessler accused the government of mounting frivolous challenges and warned she would soon impose a timeline for the tape's release. Pope Francis has denounced austerity and unbridled capitalism in a sweeping address in Bolivia. Denouncing the, quote, new colonialism of government austerity, Francis also apologized for the Catholic Church's complicity in the oppression of indigenous people in Latin America.
I say this to you with regret. Many grave sins were committed against the native peoples of America in the name of God. My predecessors acknowledged this, Selam has said it, and I too wish to say it. Like St. John Paul II, I ask that the Church kneel before God and implore forgiveness for the past and present sins of her sons and daughters. I would also say, and here I wish to be quite clear, as was St. John Paul II, I humbly ask forgiveness, not only for the offenses of the Church herself, but also for crimes committed against the native peoples during the so-called conquest of America.
Bolivian President Evo Morales presented Pope Francis with a crucifix carved into a hammer and sickle. The cross was originally designed by Jesuit activist Reverend Luis Espinal, who was assassinated by suspected Bolivian paramilitaries in 1980. Francis stopped to pray at the site where Espinal's body was dumped when he arrived in Bolivia on Wednesday. Today marks the 30th anniversary of the bombing of the Greenpeace flagship Rainbow Warrior by French agents in Auckland, New Zealand. Greenpeace photographer Fernando Pereira was killed in the attack. France has never apologized. To see our interview with Peter Wilcox, who was the captain of the Rainbow Warrior and was there at the time, you can go to democracynow.org. A federal monitor who's overseeing the New York City Police Department says officers have been failing to document encounters with people they stop and question on the street. The monitor was appointed after the NYPD's stop-and-frisk tactics were found unconstitutional. The report calls into question a recent drop in the official tally of stops. We'll have more on the NYPD and New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's landmark plans for a special prosecutor to probe police killings of unarmed civilians later in the broadcast. And Bernard Fowler, the white former Alabama state trooper who shot and killed black civil rights worker Jimmy Lee Jackson in 1965, has died at the age of 81. Fowler shot Jackson in Mac's Cafe in Marion, Alabama on February 18, 1965. Jackson died 8 days later. The killing was a seminal moment which set off the first Selma to Montgomery voting rights march known as Bloody Sunday. Dr. Martin Luther King preached at Jackson's funeral, but it wasn't until 45 years later, in 2010, that Fowler pleaded guilty to the killing, apologized, and served 5 months in jail. Fowler died on Sunday. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.